If you've been a subscriber to the channel for a while, this car may be familiar to you. Now live on PistonHeads auctions is this Nissan GT-R LM20, built to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Litchfield Motors, and in the case of the car we have here, it's the very first one to roll out of the workshop. Now, we actually drove this car in 2017, and back then it had 675 horsepower. Now, 7 years later, it's got quite a lot more than that.
Remember to head over to PistonHeads.com to research and buy your next car. There are no shortage of tuners when it comes to unlocking gargantuan amounts of power from a Nissan GT-R in Japan. But here in the UK, there are few Godzilla tamers better than Litchfield Motors. Company founder Ian Litchfield claimed to have acquired the very first R35 in Europe and has developed all sorts of outlandish packages ranging from fast road setups to track cone specials in the years since. Yes, it's also known for its nuclear strength power upgrades, but Litchfield's work goes far beyond slapping on a set of bigger turbos and calling it a day. So, on the approach to the company's 20th anniversary in 2017, Litchfield decided to pull together a decade's worth of GT-R tuning know-how and cram it all into an ultra-limited special edition. The resulting LM20, which thankfully bears no resemblance to the front-wheel drive Nissan GT-R LM Le Mans car, was a comprehensive reworking of the R35 platform, from the suspension to the aerodynamics, to create the ultimate road-going GT-R.
Not that you'd really be able to tell from a distance, because aside from the Volk Racing TE37s, it kind of looks like a standard GT-R. Look a little closer though and you'll spot some of the differences. You have a carbon fibre splitter up front with little winglets at the side, and at the rear there's a more pronounced lip on the bolt-on carbon spoiler. Now, these have been tweaked and refined in the wind tunnel to not only clean up airflow around the car, but also press the rear down into the tarmac at higher speeds. Then there are the finer details, the Litchfield branded Alcon brakes, paired here with Pagid discs. You also have Bilstein dampers built specifically for Litchfield, and they're actually paired up front with NASCAR grade springs, improving front stiffness by around 50%, and it's around 30% at the rear of the car. Now, when the LM20 came out as stock, it was seen as more of a fast road car, but really the seller of this car here found it just a little bit too firm, a little bit tramliney, so there have been some tweaks over the years to make it as best suited to the road as possible. Now, of course, there was a lot more to the LM20 than just chassis upgrades. There was obviously a huge power boost as well. So what Litchfield did is it threw in its own bespoke exhaust system, 102mm. You also got a new intercooler, an in-house air intake, and a remap to tie it all together, producing 675 horsepower and 619 pounds-feet of torque.
For reference, that's around 110 horsepower more than the standard car. But GT-R owners can never have enough power, so this LM20 was sent back to Litchfield for more work, including hybrid turbos, twin fuel pumps, and Litchfield's race intercooler and intake, which now means it produces 800 horsepower. 800 horsepower.
I couldn't have picked a worse day to drive an 800 horsepower Nissan GT-R, but I thought we'd get out of the rain and go through the interior. Not that there's a huge amount to talk about here. The only real difference is on the LM20 was a little sticker down here which says LM 20th Anniversary Edition and the build number. This is 1 of 20, which means it was the press car back in the day and the one that we drove here at PistonHeads 7 years ago. As for the rest of the cabin, well, we all know that the R35 never had the most plush interior there ever was, but Nissan actually made some big strides with the facelifted GT-R, which is what the LM20 is based off. So you got a new steering wheel design, and just the rest of the cabin feels a little bit plusher than it did before. The centre screen naturally feels a little bit outdated, but it has those old school PlayStation graphics that were designed by Gran Turismo developer Polyphony Digital, and I think they look dead cool. But it's not about the interior quality or fancy little stickers, it's about how it drives and, more importantly, how it puts 800 horsepower down on the road.
Like the owner of this LM20, you too can auction your car on PistonHeads. Just follow the link in the description, enter your details, and someone from our consignment team will be in touch. And make sure you register to bid, because we have plenty of performance, classic and collectible cars going under the hammer, just like this LM20. And here's why you should bid on it, if the prospect of an 800 horsepower Litchfield tuned GT-R wasn't enough.
When one of my predecessors picked up this LM20 back in 2017, Ian Litchfield told him that 800 horsepower was the sensible region for tuning a Nissan GT-R. Which just makes you realise how utterly bonkers these cars can be, because if you turn up to Litchfield with a big enough briefcase stuffed with cash, they'll comfortably get you above 1,000 horsepower. And that's also why 675 horsepower seemed just a little tame really when the LM20 came out, because yes, it was 110 more than the standard car, but we were so used to these huge horsepower figures from Litchfield. 675 just didn't really feel like it cut it. But it was only when I was driving in this morning that I realised that what Litchfield meant was you can get 800 horsepower out of the Nissan GT-R before you need to start beefing up the transmission and other parts of the drivetrain. Because obviously there's absolutely nothing sensible about an 800 horsepower GT-R whatsoever. Now, before I go over what this is like to drive, how it transmits so much power to the tarmac, I wanted to go over some of the tweaks that the current owner, the seller, has made to make this more drivable. Now, he claims that when it came from Litchfield, it was super hyper track focused. Now, although the LM20 was meant to be a much more road focused car, it really depends on what the customer wanted. If you came in, bought your LM20 and said, I would like it more track focused, then they would duly oblige. But it was in his experience that he found that it was tramlining quite a lot. It was finding a lot of grooves in the road and just felt a little bit unsettled. So a lot of work has been done over the past few years to really refine the setup of this car and make sure that it feels like a normal GT-R, just with a lot more horsepower. And at first, I didn't believe him. But trying this thing in the dry is really quite remarkable, because I was expecting something to feel super skittish. I mean, it's producing around 200-300 horsepower more than it did stock, but it's the way that it grips up and spits you forward so assuredly that kind of takes some of that intimidation element away, and you can just appreciate it for what it is, which is just a stupidly fast Nissan GT-R. The only problem is, this is not the dry. This is very wet conditions. I've got really unlucky with the conditions today. And with the ground a little bit greasy, a little bit slippery, this thing is an animal. I can't. It's a mighty fast thing, this. I've driven plenty of cars with north of 800 horsepower, but it's the way that the LM20 delivers its power with 800 horsepower that is just so devastating. It's quite old school in its delivery of having twin turbos. There's still just an element of a smidgen of turbo lag and then just this whoosh of torque and power that you've really got to be on top of your game and not nattering to a camera to really stay on top of it. I don't think GT-Rs get enough praise for how good their steering is, because it's a hydraulic assisted rack, which in 2017 they were starting to get phased out on a lot of its competitors. And it just means that this wheel feels like it's connected to the front wheels. And that's even more of a novelty when the rest of the car just screams technology and computers and systems keeping you on the road. But what's extra impressive about this LM20 is that with all the chassis tweaks that have been made and the extra power, the front end just feels superbly accurate. Not hyper responsive like modern supercars or hyper hatches, but it's just intuitive. And there's a bit of feel coming through the steering wheel as well. I was expecting this thing to be utterly brutal. 50% stiffness up front, 30 at the rear over a GT-R. But it really handles bumps, grooves, nasty lumps in the road with so much grace. With these Padgett discs, it does feel like more of a track setup, so it means that when you apply the brakes with a little bit of force, not a lot happens really. you've got to apply quite a bit of pressure to get a reaction from the brakes. And when they're cold, they will be a little bit squeaky. But, you know, the LM20 wasn't designed to be purely a road-focused GT-R. It's meant to be a road-focused GT-R with some track elements. And on the LM20, that means the brakes are a bit squeaky. This car is guided at 80,000 to 85,000, which is admittedly quite a lot for a Nissan GT-R, but it's worth bearing in mind that this really is very special. Obviously, it's a rare LM20. Mileage is pretty low. We've done 24,660 at the time of driving. But it's also been put together by people who really know what they're doing. That obviously goes for Litchfield. They've proven themselves to be pretty much the #1 GT-R tuner in the UK for well over a decade. But also, I just love the approach to this car and what the seller's done to it, because you see so many of these GT-R builds, they're all about stupid amounts of power, making them almost uncontrollable and just scaring people to death. And I just don't really think that's very fun. The whole point of owning a car is to be able to enjoy it on the road. And yes, while it's a little bit of a handful in wet conditions, that's only if you're driving at 80, 90, 100%. If you're just cruising around and wanting to hear the engine a little bit more and wanting to get a bit of a shove from the back, it's still perfectly docile. But you could buy a GT-R and spend tens of thousands on getting it tuned and getting crazy high horsepower figures from it. But there's also the work that goes into refining the chassis, making sure that the brakes and suspension match the amount of power that you put into it. And you don't always know that's going to be the case when you go and buy one second hand, whereas the LM20, Litchfield took quite a holistic approach. And yes, it's had more power since then, but that's also been through Litchfield. And it's just the tweaks that have been made to the chassis as well over the past few years means that this car drives superbly. It's tuned, but it's been done in that, well, I hate to use the cliche, that OEM plus way. It's just wonderful, wonderful to drive. So what are your alternatives? Well, there's the Nismo GT-R, which is a superb car and properly track focused, but that's going to cost you an extra 60, 70, 80,000 pounds. And let's not forget, no official Nissan GT-R can do 200 miles an hour. The LM20 could, and it definitely can when it's got 800 horsepower.